Welcome to the Long COVID podcast with me, Jackie Baxter. I am really excited to bring you today's episode. Please do check out the links in the show notes where you can find the podcast website, social media and support group, as well as a link to buy me a coffee if you are able. You should not rely on any medical information contained in this podcast and related materials in making medical, health-related or other decisions. Please do consult a doctor or other health professional. I love to hear from you. If you've got any suggestions or feedback or just want to say hey, then please do get in touch. I really hope you enjoy this episode, so here we go. Hello and welcome to this episode of the Long COVID podcast. I am delighted to be joined today by A K Davidson, who is a poet, and we're going to be talking about recovery and the role of writing and poetry and creativity in recovery, and I'm sure loads of other things, because it would not be an episode with me if it didn't include a tangent. So a very warm welcome to the podcast today.
Thank you. It's so lovely to be here. I really love your podcast and I listened to it a lot when I was ill myself. So it feels really special actually to be here and be recovered and be talking to you. That all feels wonderful.
Oh, I'm so delighted to have you here. And I guess as we're going to kind of dive into the other side of the coin coming out the end, that recovery, I mean, it's an amazing thing, but it's a very strange thing, I think, as well. So maybe to start with, would you mind just saying a little bit about yourself, what you do, and maybe what life was like kind of before you got sick?
Yeah, sure. So I'm a writer, an editor, a mum. I had a very, very busy life before COVID, like a lot of people, I think, who have long COVID. I was working basically full time, working for a brilliant publishing house and also looking after my 3 kids. So that was all busy in and of itself. And I had a massive commute on top of that. So I was commuting for over 3.5 hours a day. So it was full on, didn't see as much of my children as I wanted to. So actually, before I got COVID at the beginning of 2020, I'd already decided to go freelance and as a editor and writer and try to get my life back into a bit more balance. And also give myself a little bit more time for writing, because that was always something I had to do on the side outside my day job. So I was already kind of conscious before I got COVID that I needed just to kind of, get life back into a better sort of work-life balance, if you like. And then, and then everything changed. Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I can relate to some of what you're saying, and it's not everybody, but a lot of people were in this sort of similar position where, looking back, there was a lot going on. So you'd kind of sort of realized that maybe something needed to change, or that you were about to make some changes, and then it all kind of went a bit wrong. So perhaps you could sort of briefly just talk through sort of initial illness and just what your sort of main symptoms were, without kind of diving too much into the sort of traumatic detail of it, maybe.
It's quite interesting, actually, because I had acute COVID 3 times. So I had long COVID 3 times, which is quite a weird thing to say in a way. So I did recover and then I got COVID again, which I think has happened to other people as well. In fact, in 2020, I had COVID in sort of around April, I think. I didn't realise I had it at the time. But looking back, I think that must have been COVID, because it was so mild. It wasn't a big deal at all. And then I just intermittently throughout 2020, I would have these odd episodes of kind of breathlessness, even just sitting watching TV, in something funny or whatever, I would find myself breathless, which was really weird. And I didn't know what that was. And it didn't impact life too much because we were all quite sedentary, I think, in 2020 because of the lockdowns. It wasn't like there were, things that I couldn't do then. But then I did get COVID for a second time at the end of 2021. I had the same experience of fully recovering, had about 6 weeks fully recovered. And then I woke up one morning sort of feeling like I was drowning. I remember it really vividly, really weird experience. And that was sort of the beginning of long COVID. And that took me about a year to get over. And then I got COVID again in December 22 or 3. I'm going to be really bad with dates and things because it's all a bit of a blur in my mind. But then I got COVID again, and then had to sort of work through it. It is a bit of a game of snakes and ladders, isn't it? Sometimes that's how it feels like. I remember as a child, we had a board where I think there was a very big snake on 99, on square 99, just before 100, and it took you right back down to number 2 on the board. And that's what that felt like on my 3rd time getting a COVID. Here we go again. So it's been a long period between 2020 and the end of 2023. But I was not ill for all of that time. In 2020 and the start of 2021, I was kind of working pretty normally and stuff. So it's a kind of patchy experience.
Yeah, and that's really interesting about the snakes and ladders analogy that you just made, because I call it whack-a-mole. Sort of, you have a symptom and you sort of start to find something that helps that, and you think, okay. And then, hey, something else will come up, and something else and something else. And it feels like you're, constantly, whack-a-mole or firefighting. But the snakes and ladders one, I really like, because it's like, you start feeling like you're making progress, and then, oh, no, you're not. You're back down to the bottom. And certainly a couple of people have said, and actually I had an experience a bit like this as well, where you don't realize at the time, but you actually are almost there. And then you hit the snake on 99 and you feel like you're back down to 0. And actually, in hindsight, that was like the final crash. And after that, it really was a much more linear sort of onwards and upwards kind of towards recovery. But yeah, it's really interesting. And I think all these analogies, they're really helpful because they allow people to sort of visualize it, be able to understand it in a way that they maybe aren't because they haven't experienced it, I guess.
Yeah, I think images are really, really helpful. Yeah. For me, I had CFS back in the year 2000. So that was the other very strange thing in 2020, where I'd completely forgotten that I'd had chronic fatigue syndrome, because it had been a year out of my life. I had glandular fever, then chronic fatigue syndrome. Took a year to get back to full strength. And that was a really tough year, But I'd been so well since then. Until COVID, I was always so well. I'd actually completely forgotten. But my kind of body physically, I sort of remembered. With COVID, it was like my body was almost sort of saying, "Oh yeah, we recognise this." It's not that it wasn't the same as CFS, but it was kind of, obviously had sort of commonalities, I suppose. And that was a interesting experience. But also it was positive for me that I had so completely forgotten that I'd ever had CFS. I thought, fine, I will get to the point with long COVID where, although this seemed unthinkable at the moment, I will get to the point where I forget that I ever had it. And that was comforting for me.
Yeah, I think that's such a good point because, the kind of the belief in recovery, the hope and belief, you've got to hope. But that actual genuine belief. And when you're feeling absolutely dreadful, which you are for, so much of the time when you're not well, it is very hard to have that belief that you're going to get there, because you're just like, well, I just feel so awful. I can't imagine not feeling this awful. So I suppose in some ways that kind of prior experience that you'd had, I suppose it was probably a bit of a double-edged sword, but certainly knowing that you'd come out of it, and maybe some of the things that had helped you the first time around, you knew, well, if I did it once, then I can do it again, kind of thing, I suppose.
Yeah, that's right. Exactly. And it was a very different experience. And also there were no smartphones or anything like that. There wasn't a kind of social media or any of that then. It was a totally different experience. But I did know that I'd come out of it. And I also know that, funnily enough, I don't know how you experience this, but I found to a certain extent that when I've been well, I've also kind of wanted to forget that I've ever been ill. It's kind of helpful to just flip your brain into a different kind of space. And actually, one of the reasons I decided to kind of, publish the poetry and share the poetry was because that feeling, although it's helpful for me to forget, it is a little bit pulling the ladder up after you, isn't it? And I thought, actually, this is such a tough thing to go through. I do want to sort of be one of those people who talks about the fact that no, I'm better now. It's not forever. Keep the hope, keep going, because it's important to know that. And I think it's natural that when people get better, they don't actually want to dwell on having been ill. They don't want to talk about it. They want to get on with living their lives. And I do feel that to a certain extent, but I also know that when I was ill, hearing people talking about having been ill but then having recovered was massive in terms of keeping the hope and keeping going. It's just a slog, isn't it? You've just got to get up every day as best you can and keep going. So it's really, really, for me, it really helped to know that actually loads of people, well, everybody, I don't know about everybody, but people do get better. It's just you don't hear as much about the people who've got better. You hear a lot more about the people who are still in the recovery stage.
Yeah, for sure. I think for me, there's definitely an element of I don't want to be dwelling on every single second of my recovery because, there were some absolutely awful, I mean, there were many awful days and there were some days that were, beyond awful within that. And I think, dwelling on it, as you say, living in that experience that actually you've left behind is not healthy. So actually in some ways moving on and, as you say, living your life because you are able to do that is important. But I think the flip side of that for me is, as you say, absolutely sharing that you have recovered, because when you haven't, it's helpful to hear that there are people who are recovering. But I think the other bit of it for me is remembering, the kind of lessons that I learned through that. So I remember someone saying pacing is a skill for life. And I'm thinking, you know what, in some ways it sort of is, and you don't have to dramatically pace in life, when you're not unwell, but just being mindful of the balance in life and some of that I think kind of is helpful. And some of those tools that I learned while I was ill are actually tools that are really helpful now for me in life. I mean, breathing is obviously the ones that I tend to go to most, but that there are others as well. And certainly that's how I feel. It's taking those lessons and using them in my life rather than dwelling too much in the past, I suppose. Yeah.
It's such a hard thing to go through, and I don't think it's particularly something that you need or want to go through. But there are, of course, amazing lessons that you can draw from it to for the rest of your life, really. I mean, I know for me that I said before I had a very busy job. I didn't really have time to write as much as I wanted to. And, I've had lots of time to write since, over the last 3 years, which has been a double-edged sword. And obviously, a lot of writing you can do in your head, or, you do in your head. So it's a great thing when you're ill, even when you've got quite a short amount of energy, there's still stuff you can do. So sometimes I think to myself, oh gosh, be careful what you wish for, because I wished for more time to do writing, and the universe gave it to me. It gave me lots and lots of time at home, unable to work, and unable to do much else really. So, you could choose to think it's a curse, or you could see the good side of that as well, So, and I totally agree with you. All the tools that you learn to get through being ill and recover, they're all just good tools for life. They really are.
We'll be right back. I'm interrupting myself for a second to tell you about long COVID breathing. The fabulous Vicky Jones and I have teamed up to bring you long COVID breathing. We are both passionate about sharing our expertise and experience of the breath and how incredibly helpful that can be with long COVID. We've worked together to develop a course that is specifically tailored to those with long COVID. It's a 6-week course with 12 sessions, all delivered online. The community feel and learning that we're all sharing is such a joy. To find out more information and to sign up for our courses, workshops and other shorter sessions, please check out the link below, longcovidbreathing.com, or email longcovidbreathing@gmail.com to start your breathing journey with us. Yeah, I think I'm the sort of person that, always tries to take the positives from things and, not to dismiss the awfulness of the experience, because the experience was horrendous, and it's different for everybody. But, I don't think anyone who has been through long COVID or any illness that is kind of relatable to that would ever say that the experience wasn't awful. But okay, well, sure, it's awful, but can we take something from it? And as you say, you had a lot of time to write. You learnt a load of tools that you can now take forward, and maybe there are other positives as well. So I think it's probably, certainly for me, better to focus on that rather than I lost 3 and a bit years of my life, because that is also true, but it's not going to help.
It is and it isn't. You've lost it in some ways, but in other ways you've still been doing things and learning things. That's how I look at it, I think. And so certainly for me, I'd never written poetry before I got ill. That was brand new. In fact, I'd never really I'd always had quite a lot of imposter syndrome around poetry. I'd never quite felt like I understood it, or that I was, to the point where it used to kind of irritate me quite a lot sometimes, poetry, because I'd read stuff and I think I don't understand why people think this is brilliant. And I sort of think, what's wrong with me that I don't get this? And so I was a non-fiction writer. That's for money, and then sort of fiction for pleasure as a hobby, but I'd never engaged with poetry at all. And really it was that sort of experience of being ill and having to kind of find the sort of the joy and the beauty and the humor in the most mundane things, because that was all you were able to engage with. That's kind of what led me to poetry, because sort of it's this miniature canvas in one way, but then in another way it's enormous. So I kind of love the fact that poems they're kind of bite-sized. If you've not got much energy or whatever, you can still engage with them. They're just a nice little morsel, but so they're kind of bite-sized in terms of how much kind of energy or time you need to engage with them, unlike reading a whole novel, or watching a complicated film with a difficult plot that you might just not have the energy for. You can absorb a poem, and yet even though it's so kind of short and sweet, it's sort of bigger than the sum of its parts. The resonances it has and that it can carry can be absolutely enormous. So it's kind of perfect or for me, I found it really, really perfect for that kind of state of being unwell and being short on energy and all of those things, and just so powerful, really, such a brilliant tool. So I came to love it, having sort of not exactly hated it. Well, I mean, at certain times I did a literature degree, French and Italian literature, and I had to study French and Italian poetry, and I did hate it. I hate it, actually, to be honest. But I kind of moved from that to loving it. So that was, for me, that was a really joyous thing, and a great, something wonderful. Definitely some lemonade, from all those lemons.
I think it's a really good point about the bite-sized as well. I mean, we talked about pacing earlier, and I think, certainly for me, I used to read a lot. I would literally eat books for breakfast. I would read so much, and suddenly not being able to do that, or I would really struggle with reading. And I started doing audiobooks, which was great, but I know that some people don't get on with that for whatever reason. And actually, yeah, I think, I sort of wish that I had discovered poetry, because maybe I would have got something from it as well, whether reading it or writing it, probably reading rather than writing. But, being able to sort of just read a little bit, because as you say, it might only be like 6 lines or something, but I think it will kind of keep working its way through your brain. It kind of makes you think, doesn't it? And, in some ways, maybe if you're thinking about the 6 lines of poetry you've just read, rather than how incredibly awful you feel, then it's almost like it gives you a little bit of a break from that, doesn't it?
That's exactly right. And I find it so helpful if I'm feeling a bit overwhelmed or exhausted or whatever. I take myself back to a poem, and I recite the words in my head, and it just kind of gets my thoughts back under control and into a good place. And I've got one poem in the book is that I wrote right at the end when I was recovered. So it's a recovered poem. And sometimes I just sort of recite that to myself if I need a boost. And it actually does give me a boost. It's kind of extraordinary. And I just, that whole experience of kind of capturing big feelings and putting them into something kind of compact and on the page. It kind of gets it out of your head, out of your mind. And it's not that they don't exist, those feelings, or that they've disappeared. They're there, but they're kind of under control. And I find that really, really helpful. Um, I always feel with poetry, I think the thing that held me back before was you kind of need to find poems that really resonate with you, that relate to your own experience. And that's why they're so amazing, poems, when there's something that makes sense to you personally, you feel it and you totally get what the poet is talking about. But a lot of the time, it's poetry written by, long dead people who lived in a different time and a different place, and you can't really completely relate to what they're talking about. Obviously, the great poet talking love or grief you can, but it's still sometimes hard to really understand, really feel it the way they're feeling it, which is why, I don't know, it seemed important in a way to have long COVID poetry, because it's enormous, this experience. It's really enormous. And so many people are going through it, millions of people. It feels like there should be poetry around the experience of long COVID, which isn't exclusive to long COVID, because all those kind of themes like grief and loneliness, but also the power of friendship, all those things obviously relate to everybody, and all sorts of and other illnesses as well. But I just I don't know, it felt very satisfying somehow to think, no, let's make a long COVID collection for everybody who's on this weird, difficult journey.
Yeah, and we do now start to understand a bit more about, the power of creativity and healing, of, as you say, getting some of those braining things, those thoughts that are flying around our head, you know, to kind of calm down a little bit somehow. We now understand a bit more about the idea of, the cognitive rest as well as the physical rest. And it sounds like maybe your brain is a little bit like mine in that it's always busy. And it's very hard to shut that down. And, there are all sorts of things that people use. Yoga Nidra was one of my favorites to actually shut my brain off. But actually sometimes getting those thoughts out and on paper, so to speak. I suppose it's a bit like, when you have 20 million thoughts running around your head and you're trying to get to sleep. And it's like, okay, I'm just going to write myself a to-do list for tomorrow and then I can go to bed because it's out. And I feel like maybe this is a sort of similar to that, whatever those thoughts are, being able to kind of put them somewhere, park them almost, isn't it?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And also just find the perfect way to express something. Because I think if you a poem is so boiled down, isn't it? And if you just take these enormous feelings and just boil them down and boil them down and think, what is it that I'm trying to say? Then you can kind of capture it. It's almost like putting it under a glass jar. It's like, stay there and be what you are. That's fine, but stay there. And I don't know. I mean, I think for me, the big thing for me was when I started actually putting poems on Instagram, because I'm a total Luddite and I'm very kind of uncomfortable with social media, and I'm and also quite a private person. So to start doing that for me I was thinking, God, I must be unwell to be doing this, because I obviously, I sort of felt like I had nothing left to lose in a way. Um, but that was an amazing experience for me, because when people respond and it's kind of helped them, or brought them some joy, or even just, I think when somebody else understands what you're going through, I mean, you almost sort of physically feel your shoulders drop, the sort of relief that someone gets it. And I think particularly with long COVID, because it's so invisible sometimes, people, I look back on photographs of myself when I was ill and I look so well. I can totally understand why people didn't get it. And I think, particularly with long COVID, the doctors and nurses don't understand either, do they? I mean, it's improving, I think. But I know at first when I went, I had to go and get my blood pressure, heart rate checked by the nurse at the GP surgery, and she was, oh, so why are you here? And I said, oh, I've got long COVID. She's like, oh, long COVID. Oh, what's that then? She's never heard of it. And that's the person who's supposed to be trying to make you better. So that's tough. I found that tough. Um, that sort of realization that there was no safety net, really. There was no medical support. And so for that reason, just getting that recognition and sort of from other people, feeling visible, feeling seen and heard with what you were going through, and hopefully helping other people feel seen and heard, because receiving support is fantastic, isn't it? But actually it's also really life enhancing to feel you've helped somebody else. That helps you, makes you better, doesn't it? To feel you do this amazing podcast. So I imagine that you get a kick out of knowing that you're really reaching people and helping people that you've never met before. That's amazing. So that's also that power of connection, really, I think, and people find it in different ways, but I definitely got that from writing the poetry, but then sharing it as well.
Yeah, and I think we know now about, the power of social connection and how important that is, in everybody. And it's something that when you have something like long COVID, that you can kind of lose very, very quickly because no one understands you. You don't have the energy, you're not able to participate in life, really, in the things that you did, in the ways that you used to connect with people. So you very, very quickly become very, very isolated. And maybe you do have a few people that you connect with, but maybe not. People who live on their own, I think, must have a really hard time with this. And it must be really, really difficult. So being able to connect at all, I think, is important, and I think social media is both a blessing and a curse, I think, in many ways. But, in terms of helping people to feel connected, I think it is quite powerful. And I think, recently, themes that have come up on the podcast kind of recently, the idea of connection, of course, but also this idea of vulnerability, that kind of enables you to make those connections. And I think the two kind of go hand in hand. And, by putting out poems that you've written, I think you are kind of opening yourself up to that kind of vulnerability. You said that you felt a little bit, slightly uncomfortable doing it to start with. But then, what came back from that was this connection with people where you were, as you say, both giving and receiving support. And I think that kind of, two-way process is incredibly powerful, I think. And it's not something certainly that I would have wanted to do. I've always needed to be perfect. I've bit of a recovering perfectionist. And yeah, the idea of being vulnerable and certainly being invulnerable in front of lots of people is like, gosh, and you sort of get used to it, I think, once you start. Certainly that was my experience. It became a lot more natural once you've done it the first few times. We'll be right back. Hey there, I'm just jumping in for a second to see if you're enjoying this episode. If you're finding it useful, maybe you would consider sharing it somewhere, a friend, a group, or even on your Twitter feed. If everyone was able to share just once, we'd be able to get this information out to even more people who really, really need it. So please consider sharing somewhere if you possibly can. I hope you enjoy the episode, and thank you so much.
I think it does get easier, but I'm not sure it will ever be easy. I think as a writer, because I was a professional non-fiction writer, so that's something where you can kind of, it's not you putting yourself on the page. I still am. But obviously for fiction and poetry, you get the best response. It's the authenticity, isn't it, that people can sense and smell and really respond to. And I think, long COVID sort of pushed me into really doing that wholeheartedly. So I'm sort of grateful for for that. But like you say, it's so lonely, isn't it? It's so lonely being ill, and I'm ever so lucky. I live with my husband and my children, so I'm part of a family. But it's still everybody else is going about their day, and you're not, and you can't even. When it's bad, like you say, you can't even escape in a novel or escape in a, TV. I did get well enough to work through the back catalogue of Mad Men, which I'd never watched. And that was great when I got to that point. But, when you're really ill, you can't do anything like that. And that is a very lonely place to be. So yeah, I think social media certainly has its faults, but having come at it more with its faults in my mind, it was actually really lovely to discover the sort of really uplifting kind of creative communities on there, people creating the most amazing art and everything as well, which was so wonderful to follow. And I had a peer support group with the Yoga for Life project. They were a real help to me. It's an amazing organization. They offer a kind of yoga and breathing and healing online for people with long COVID as well as people with other conditions. And I was a member of, there was a peer support group, which was just brilliant. And a lot of the people from there were creating the most amazing art in all sorts of ways online. So just seeing that was wonderful as well.
Yeah, that's amazing. Because I think, as you say, when you're alone with your own thoughts, and that is often not a very comfortable place, and I sometimes think actually if I'm that uncomfortable with my own thoughts, it's probably something I should do more often. But when you're unwell, it's a really, really awful place to be. So yeah, for sure. And you just mentioned the Yoga for Life project. So I take it they were something that was very helpful for you in your recovery. Was there anything else? I mean, you've spoken a lot about how the writing was very, very helpful. What else was there that was sort of helpful in your recovery?
Yeah, so quite a few things. Is all a bit hazy, the timeline. But one of the things I did quite early on was a friend of mine whose son had long COVID recommended a lady who I'm not sure what she would call herself, but she sort of natural healing of all sorts. And I saw her and she actually she did some assessments and adjusted my diet. So I adjusted my diet and that was really helpful. So I'm a big subscriber to the whole gut health thing, trying to, eat a wide variety of, plants and all the rest of it, all that stuff. But the microbiome. I actually did a York test, which is a thing you can do to find out if I had any food intolerances. Somebody suggested that, and I was totally amazed when I discovered that I did have some food intolerances. And so I think cutting some things out of my diet on the basis of that really helped. So adjusting my diet definitely helped. I felt it transform my mood because I'd been quite down at the point that I'd seen her, because it had really hit home that this wasn't just some sort of minor inconvenience as it had been in 2020. This was actually quite life-changing. And, how was I going to earn a living and all those questions? So diet. And also I saw an osteopath, and that was brilliant for me because I walked in the room for my first appointment, and that was about a good year in or whatever. I'd had long COVID for about a year at least then. I walked in the room and he looked at me and he said, "What happened to you?" And that was so amazing because, like we've said, it's so invisible normally. He was the first actual kind of, medical professional who could see that something was wrong with me. So that felt really validating, even though it sounds a bit weird. And apparently I was all out of alignment. And I think I'd been breathing so badly that I hadn't been breathing in my upper chest at all, I think. And he just did various things. And for the first time after that session, I could feel the breath going right up into my upper chest. And I realized that I hadn't been breathing there for like months and months and months. And actually, I mean, I know you know huge amounts about breathing, but I had thought, and when I look back, I slightly kick myself for this. I played the flute for years when I was at school. And also I've got kids, so I've learned breathing for childbirth and stuff. So I sort of felt quite smug about my breathing. I thought I was really good at breathing. I mean, probably most people think they're good at breathing because, we're all here alive. But I felt a bit smug, and I was like, of course I know about the diaphragm and diaphragmatic breathing, and why are people saying that? Of course anyway, it was a bit of a revelation to discover that, yeah, I'd been breathing great into my belly, but I had not been breathing up I've been using the full expanse of my lungs at all. So then I started taking breathing exercises seriously, finding out about them and doing them, and that really made a big difference. And then I got a POTS diagnosis quite late on. and having a diagnosis felt pretty amazing again. It's like, oh, I've got something that other people have and can recognize, and I can do things. So I listened to Dr. Boon Lim talking. He was really helpful. So those were the key things. I know that every time I've been swimming in the sea, it's been amazing. But that's not something I'm able to do. I'm not near the sea, so that's not something I can do very much. But I think those were the main things. I did take quite a lot of supplements and things, but I don't know. It's impossible to know, isn't it, what helped and what didn't.
Yeah, I think it's, everything is so individual because everyone is different. So, there's so many crossovers, every person I speak to, you sort of think, okay, they went a slightly different route to me, but they did that thing in the same way. They did that with, so you're able to kind of see. And, yeah, some people have access to certain things. Some people would love to do cold water, but don't have any, for example. And, as you say, we don't always know exactly what things it was that helped the most because you're maybe trying several all at once. And maybe it was actually the combination of doing the diet plus the breathing plus, the writing, that really kind of worked together. And in some ways it sort of doesn't matter, does it?
No, I think it all helps. The other thing I did at the very end, because like I say, I kind of recovered from CFS, I recovered from long COVID twice, and then I had it again. And I did get to the point where I thought, well, I'm probably going to catch COVID again because I've got a big family. And so I'd started to get to the point where I was getting worried about that, thinking, I'm basically fine now, but what happens when I catch COVID again? So I did do some brain training as well. That was the other thing that I did at the very end. And that I found fascinating and really helpful as well, actually. So that was the sort of last piece of the jigsaw for me. It gave me really good tools that now I feel this year kind of confident about staying well. So I feel quite different in a way to how I did when I recovered in previous times, whereas always conscious I could get it again. Whereas maybe I will get it again, but I do feel much confident that I'm resilient now to infection, and that I've got the tools, because it's about having the tools, really, isn't it? I mean, life throws all sorts of stuff in all sorts of ways at all of us. It's just whether you feel that you can cope with it and whether physically you can cope with it.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point because, getting sick at all, but, having recovered and then getting sick again, there's that fear, isn't there? Well, it happened to me once. What is stopping it happening to me again? And, I think partly for me, it's that I'm living a much better life than I was before. So actually, I'm healthier, I'm more resilient than I was anyway. Um, but yeah, I think even knowing that, there's still that kind of worry, isn't there? Well, I thought I was fine before. So, I think I'm fine now. What's the difference?
That's right. And because I've been on that rodeo a few times now, I think that's what made me think, yeah, I'm just going to explore everything that's out there. And I'm really glad I did, because that really, really worked for me and helped me. And I think because I know sort of that question about how do you know when you're recovered, you know, I don't think that's possible to answer really that question, because I think, like you say, you live your life in a bit of a different way. Um, so in some ways, but in other ways, you also know that it's a kind of part of who you are. So you need to be mindful, really, about how you live, which means, taking health seriously, looking after yourself, all of those things.
Yeah, it is a really interesting question, isn't it? Because I've had people ask me this before, at what point were you fully recovered? Was it when you could do everything that you could do before? And I'm thinking, well, yes and no. Because, at the point where I was fully recovered, that was where I said, well, you know, I'm obviously very unfit, but I feel like I can push myself in the way a normal person would. So, in that way, I wasn't back to 100% of what I was before, but I had the ability to put myself in the position where I could be. And then, since that moment, which was almost a year ago, actually. You know, things have changed so much since then that I'm almost thinking, was I a bit premature in declaring myself recovered? But I think actually it was part of the process, you know, and since then I've got more better. So, in some ways it doesn't matter. In some ways I think sometimes you've just got to say, yeah, okay, I'm good. And then, things will continue to change because they continue to change in everyone's life. Like no one is static, are they? As you were just saying, stress in whatever form that comes will come at everybody. So, it's not like you say, right, okay, I'm good. And then that is how you're going to be for, things are always going to change, aren't they? They're always in flux. And that is just part of being quote unquote normal, I suppose.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I think the way I think about it now is all through the COVID period, I was kind of getting knocked back and back and back. Whereas now I'm in an upward spiral. So it's like when you kind of recover from long COVID, you don't suddenly run a marathon, because apart from anything else, I've been incredibly sedentary for like, a couple of years. So you're just like normally unfit, standardly unfit because you've sat on the sofa a lot. But I feel like everything I do now I'm building up my health and my stamina and my fitness. And, that feels honestly amazing. It's just such a brilliant. I actually had a gym induction yesterday. I got someone I go swimming and I got someone at the swim to show me how to use the machines in the gym because I'd not been to a gym for like, years and years and years. Haven't quite made it onto the machines yet. But just the idea, I kind of looked at myself from the outside and I thought, wow, you're having a gym induction. You really are in so much of a better place than you were. That's an incredible feeling. It really is.
Yeah, it's the possibility, I think. It's that you go from this place where you have so few choices, you have so little control, and even once you start to find things that help and you start feeling like you do have a little bit of control, you still don't feel like you have all of that control. Your choices are so limited to this kind of other side of it where suddenly it's terrifying because you could do anything. And that is both a wonderful, incredible feeling, but also it is quite scary in some ways because, you do have too many choices almost. But, if you were to choose one, you would obviously choose the too many choices. But it is quite a strange thing coming out of there, I think. Um, so do you have any like advice that you would have given to yourself? What would you have liked to have heard Anna of early 2020?
Yeah, as an interesting question. I don't I I think you just have to keep putting one foot forward, don't you? I think you've got to keep the hope because here is recovery. There's you, there's me, there's a zillion other people, and keep going. I mean, I don't feel, qualified to offer that sort of thing. If I look back on myself, I mean, I had a couple of relapses because I bit off more than I could chew. And when I look back at that now, I think, oh, it was really stupid, you know. So in a way, I would sort of say to my past self, don't, be more accepting of, of what you can do. But then on the other hand, I think, well, a little bit of sort of denial is almost important in a way because you have to keep pushing forward as well, don't you? So I don't really berate myself for that. I mean, I think where there was an occasion where I sort of let other people down in a work context because I hadn't appreciated the sort of, where I was at. And that I feel terrible about. That's not good. It's not something that I like to do or would normally do. So, ideally I wouldn't have done that. But at the same time, you do have to just keep trying, don't you? And you can't get it right all the time. So yeah, just keep trying.
I think that's a really good point because you don't know where your boundaries are if you don't find them. And, sometimes you're going to find them by falling flat on your face. And sometimes you're going to go, oh, okay, I judged that better this time. And then they're changing all the time anyway, as things fluctuate, as you see improvement, those boundaries aren't always in the right place, in the place you expect them to be. So, yeah, I think, trial and error definitely was something that I learned, to accept the errors.
Yeah, and being open-minded. Yeah, I think being open-minded to what you can try. And also, I think this is really tricky, but I think when you're ill, it's so upsetting that there isn't the help and support for this devastating illness that there is for other devastating illnesses, or not even making comparisons. That's a ridiculous thing to do. But it's very upsetting that it's invisible and it's not acknowledged, and that workplaces don't know really how to do a phased return because that's really complicated with long COVID. And people say it doesn't even exist. That's all balmy and weird. All that stuff is so upsetting. I think when you're ill, you can sort of want to take on the world and shout and fight and everything. And that's obviously needs to be done, and that's wonderful stuff to do. But at the same time, I kind of think for your own nervous, certainly for me anyway, for my own nervous system, I had to just let that go because it's not actually wasn't helping me get better. So I sort of think I'd rather now that I'm better try and help and try and shout, wait till you're better and then do that. I mean, one of the things I did that really helped me was I always used to wake up to the news, I always used to have like Radio 4 come on in the mornings. And during COVID, when I was ill, I just couldn't cope with it. I couldn't cope with that onslaught of bad news that I was powerless to affect coming into my bedroom. So I switched over to Radio 3, and now I listen to Petruk Trelawney on the Radio 3 breakfast show. And it is such a wonderful, uplifting way to start the day. The music is so beautiful, and I can't do much about world affairs. So just hearing it, having it rammed home that I couldn't do much about these awful things happening was really unhelpful. And actually, so just I stopped listening to the news, and I think that helped me get better, And I think then when you're strong, you can re-engage with that stuff.
Yeah, and I think, it's about what you feed yourself, isn't it? Whether it's food, whether it's water, whether it's air you breathe, or whether it's, what you're feeding your nervous system. I think all of those things are important. And certainly I think we tend to forget that sometimes, for sure. So your book is going to be released early June. So hopefully this will be coinciding with that. Um, but yeah, I'm super excited for this. It's going to be amazing. I think, as you say, people are going to really resonate with this, even if it's, reading one a day. And, isn't that beautiful that people can do that? You can really dip in and out as you feel able to do so. Anna, would you like to read us something from your book?
Yes, sure. It's really hard to know what to pick because there's sort of all flavors in the book. Some are sad and some are kind of like funny, and they kind of cover all different aspects, I think, of kind of everyday life with a chronic illness. The book is called Poetry for Life and Other Chronic Conditions, short poems from long COVID. So I'll read this one, which is called Well Dressed. And it's really about something that we haven't sort of talked much about, but something that I think was quite a big deal for me. The fact that it's really hard to keep up with some friends when you're ill because you're going through such a big experience that's so difficult to explain. They can't really understand it, and you don't have the energy to explain, nor to perhaps be the sort of friend that you were when you were well. I think that's all quite difficult and quite complicated. But the way I chose to look at it was that these friends don't disappear. They're still your friends forever. You just have the right friend at the right moment. It doesn't mean they go away. So anyway, I wrote a poem about that, and it's called Well Dressed. Each autumn, I pack my summer clothes away, rediscover cozy wool and knee-length winter boots. Right now, my summer friends are distant too. My dancing, laughing, flirting party pals who live life hard and loud at 90 miles per hour. I love them, but they're not right for this season. My autumn friends like gentle walks and quiet films. When the winter's here again, I'll cherish all the comforters who'll soothe and make life better. silk vest, cashmere sweater, ideal for freezing weather. Spring will come eventually. Brand new friendships root and bud, then they start to bloom. Now my heart is bursting, but there's more than enough room. Every friend is stored, and each one's time will come.
That's beautiful. That's such a lovely idea. Well, thank you so much, Anna, for joining me today. It's been such a pleasure hearing your story, hearing you talk about your work. I will make sure that the link to your book goes into the show notes. So please, everyone, go out and buy that because it sounds amazing. And yeah, good luck with everything.
Thank you so much. It's been so great to talk to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much to all of my guests and to you for listening. I hope you've enjoyed it, or at least found it useful. The Long COVID podcast is entirely self-produced and self-funded. I'm doing all of this myself. If you're able to, please go to buymeacoffee.com/longcovidpod to help me cover the costs of hosting the podcast. Please look out for the next episode of the Long COVID podcast. It's available on all the usual podcast hosting things. And do get in touch